Now, Lenin in this regard says clearly that in line with the position of Engels during the late 19th century that, quote, in a democratic republic, Engels continues, wealth wields its power indirectly, but all the more effectively. First, by means of direct corruption of the officials, and he mentions America. Second, by means of the alliance of the government with the stock exchange, which takes place, he mentions both France and the United States. As if Engels could have been writing this in 2010. With the specific relevance of the situation today in the city of Detroit, the U.S. and the world, Lenin says that, quote, at the present time, imperialism and the domination of the banks have developed to an unusually fine art both these methods of defending and asserting the omnipotence of wealth in democratic republics of all descriptions, unquote. We can see clearly in the policies enacted by the capitalist state in relations to the financial crisis and the role of multinational oil firms such as BP, which can act as an institution that cannot be controlled or seized by the administration or by the U.S. Congress. So it's still going on, brothers and sisters. It's still going on. You know, the multinational corporations still control the state. Now we see what's going on down in Louisiana, on the Gulf. I mean, it is atrocious. And what is the president doing about it?
Nothing.
He's handcuffed.
He can't.
He's handcuffed by these same multinational corporations and financiers. He could just take over BP.
ABC.
He should.
They forfeited their right to do business in this country.
Yes.
Why doesn't he just say, okay, you guys are out, the government is taking over, we're going to administer the stopping of this oil leak and its cleanup.
And pay the workers.
Exactly. And compensate the workers, their families who were killed, the people who are going to be suffering, the fishermen who have lost their way of life. When he's cursing,
ABC.
but he ain't doing nothing.
Yeah, he cursed.
Anybody can curse. Anybody can curse. So hey, it's heavy. It's heavy. Now, I want to continue on with this. In chapter 2 of Lenin's State and Revolution, he talks about the transformation of the capitalist state. And that's what we have to do. We have to transform capitalism. And the only way we can do that is to overturn the capitalist state and to seize power and administer the state on behalf of working people and the oppressed. Now, in chapter 2 of Lenin's State and Revolution, he reflects on the fundamental need for socialist revolution aimed at empowering the working class to take control of the state. And he also sums up the lessons of the revolutionary period in Europe between 1841 and 1848 and 1851. There were revolutionary upheavals in Europe during this time period. In fact, when Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, it was in the midst, or right on the verge of a revolutionary upheaval. You know, a lot of bourgeois scholars say, well, Marx really wasn't involved in practical political activity. That's totally false. You know, he was part of this group called the Communist League. He was a co-founder of the International Working Men's Association, what's known as the First International. Marx was in the thick of the revolutionary struggles that were going on the European continent during the 1840s and 1850s. In fact, his newspaper was shut down. He was barred from teaching in universities, and he was forced out of the European continent. That's why he had to settle in England, and that's where he did a lot of his research during the latter years of his life. He couldn't make a living. He was largely financed by Frederick Engels, who was, inherited some industrial facilities, in Germany. So it's not true that Marx was not involved in practical revolutionary activity. Not true at all. Now, Lenin notes that, quote, the doctrine of the class struggle as applied by Marx to the question of the state and the socialist revolution leads inevitably to the recognition of the political rule of the proletariat, of its dictatorship, i.e. of a power shared with none and relying directly upon the realizable only by the transformation of the proletariat into the ruling class, able to crush the inevitable and desperate resistance of the bourgeoisie, and to organize for the new economic order all the toiling and exploited masses, unquote. In other words, in order to solve these problems, the workers have to seize power. They have to transform the capitalist state into a socialist state. What does the working class need to do to fulfill this historical task? Lenin says that, quote, the proletariat needs state power, the centralized organization of force, the organization of violence, both for the purpose of crushing the resistance of the exploiters and for the purpose of guiding the great mass of the population, the peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie, the semi-proletarians, into the work of organizing a socialist economy, unquote. Lenin addressed the role of the proletarian party in capitalist society facing terminal crisis. He declares that, quote, by educating a workers' party, Marxism educates the vanguard of the proletariat, capable of assuming power and of leading the whole people to socialism, of directing and organizing the new order, of being the teacher, guide, and leader of all the toiling and exploited in the task of building up their social life without the bourgeoisie and against the bourgeoisie, unquote. Now, the question of national oppression, decolonization, and revolutionary violence is also key because Detroit is a majority African-American city. African-Americans suffer national oppression as a result of slavery, Jim Crow, and continued racial discrimination. Now, in most discussions about the modern urban crisis that are carried out by the ruling class, its spokespersons, and government, as well as petty bourgeois and idealistic elements, a definition of crime and violence are in most cases, in most instances, stripped of its class character. People just talk about violence. They just talk about crime. Right. They don't attribute it to any type of class structure within society. There's no distinction made, according to these people, between interpersonal violence among the people and the social violence that is carried out by the capitalist state against the people. In fact, for political reasons, there's always a greater emphasis placed on the violence among the people. It is the fear of street crime that is used to justify greater spending on local and national law enforcement practice. We hear it all the time. We need more cops on the street. All the time we hear this. Now, going back to the 1960s, the rise in street crime is always utilized as an explanation for the so-called decline of the cities. In Detroit, the popular notion that is promoted is that the proliferation of street crime is the fundamental reason why the city went into decay. Totally false. Totally false. Detroit was already going into decay even after World War II. Now, this rise in street crime is always linked to the increased migration of African Americans into the city. They may not say it directly, but it's a subtle message that's always left to the general public.
That's right.
The implication is that the inherent violent character of African Americans can only be addressed through the mass outmigration of the whites and some middle-class blacks and the recruitment of police officers to control the people who are creating a dangerous atmosphere in the city. Of course, there's never any real discussion about the traditionally higher rates of unemployment that exist among the African American people. There's the total exclusion of any notion of the historical legacy of racial discrimination, of lynching, housing problems, poor education, and class oppression as having any relationship to the interpersonal violence among the people.
Go ahead, brother.
Our position is that there is a distinction, and there's a distinction to be made between the violence among the people and the social violence of the state against the people. Now, among the nationally oppressed, both forms of violence are state sanctioned. They don't give a damn about us killing each other and stabbing each other every weekend. They don't care. In fact, it's encouraged, you know, by the media and by the state. In fact, you know, that'll get more media coverage than this meeting tonight, or if we have a demonstration down at City Hall. You know, they'll cover somebody getting stabbed or something like that more so. And for example, the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office. I mean, what about the crime of these cops who kill civilians? She never says anything about that, does she? Nothing. Nothing. But Kwame Kilpatrick, yeah, she's go to the wall to put him in prison. Yeah, you know, he's destroyed some lives of some top police officials. He's got to go. Yeah, he's got to go. So now our position is that, like I said, you know, we think there's definitely a distinction to be made. You know, there's definitely a distinction to be made. There is no real effort by the bourgeoisie to end street crime in the African American community, none whatsoever. At the same time, every act of violence carried out by the police against the African American people is justified with the false claim of fighting crime. Same thing in the murder of Ayanna Stanley Jones. Right. There was a murderer in the house. You know, they were selling drugs in the house. Okay, this justifies the murder of a child.